Mary Robinson and Martin Khor.
Thank you.
Mary.
Okay. Shall I go over here?
Yes, yes, take the podium.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and it's genuinely a pleasure to renew old friendships because many of us are veterans of the Helsinki process, and we also welcome new participants. And one value of the fact that we've been brought back together again is that we're not starting from scratch. We're actually starting from a different place, which is why, as you said rightly, I think, okay, the exchange informally is also important. And I was enthusiastic about the Helsinki process from the beginning, and I remain of the view that it has made a contribution. It has not solved all the problems, but it has made a contribution, and it's a base which we can build on. And that base really builds on the core notion, and I quote, the notion that every stakeholder, governments, civil society, business community, international organizations, academia and media, can play a major role in accelerating thinking on global problem solving and in making globalization benefit all. I'm going to say quite a number of critical things, as others have done, because I think we need to be honest about the extent of the problems that we have. But I'd just like to take a moment to compliment the two countries that gave leadership 10 years ago and in this process and continue to give leadership today, Finland and Tanzania. I think it's a really interesting partnership between two countries that have good reputations for democracy, for advancing their own situations, but who are reaching out, who are looking beyond their own countries and giving that leadership. And I just wanted to pay that tribute. As we've heard, it's almost a cliche to say that we live in a time of change, but that can truly be said of the period that we're living through. Huge changes are taking place on the global scene. Indeed, it's no exaggeration to describe developments in the first part of this century as cataclysmic. Old orders are changing, new trends and new lead players are emerging. And unfortunately, the way forward is far from clear. Because the problem, and this is the area that we will be particularly looking at in this section, the problem is that a feature of the present situation is that governance structures and global leaders are not responding well to the changes around us. Rather, they seem paralyzed and unable to react. Failures in global governance are to be found everywhere. The systems which oversee and shape the actions of states and peoples are not functioning as they should. In some cases, systems of global governance have failed to keep pace with the rapid changes in the world. In other cases, they failed to deliver on the basic purposes for which they were established. Perhaps the most obvious failure can be seen on the economic front. The world is facing the worst economic crisis in recent memory, with the Eurozone countries in particular confronting enormous challenges. Bad banking practices, government indebtedness and lax regulation have all played a part. My own country, Ireland, has experienced a severe economic downturn, as have other EU countries. The global financial crisis has left no country untouched. Austerity measures, as we've heard already this morning, mean that many will face hardship in the years ahead and face it in a very undermining of democratic participation way. And I want to really have us reflect on that. Youth unemployment has reached alarming levels. People have lost confidence in an economic system which sees poor people penalized in order to bail out banks and pay off budget deficits, while the people at the top continue to award themselves lavish salaries and bonuses. In short, we're witnessing the impacts of unsustainable. Also, something that I think we have to take very seriously, a breakdown in trust in government and in the financial system. It's not an exaggeration to speak of a crisis of confidence in the capacity of the present economic system to respond to the challenges of our time. And this is reflected in market confidence. It's reflected also in the fact that this is not something that affects all countries equally. The economic crisis is very much a particular crisis for Europe and the United States. But in China, India, the rest of the BRICS, they are experiencing quite significant growth. And also in a number of African countries, such as Tanzania itself, Ghana, Uganda and others, they have experienced healthy GDP growth in recent years. Indeed, the predictions for the continent as a whole were for the growth of 5% in 2011. So where does that leave the issue of the response from a democratic perspective? I think one of the most significant changes that has happened, it was happening already perhaps when we began our Helsinki process, but it has intensified, is that we have a widespread desire now for participatory democracy. That's what brought people out onto the streets and squares of Arab countries over the last year, aided by social media, which enabled them to seek safety in numbers. It's also at the root of the Occupy movements in many industrialized countries, challenging the status quo and demanding more fairness and equity in how they're governed. It manifests itself in the mass demonstrations that can take place, or in email campaigns that can be organized rapidly on a particular issue by media-savvy, social media-savvy groups. I believe that this is a trend which will intensify as more and more young people in particular can access the technologies which give them connectivity and wider horizons of knowledge. There are risks that participatory democracy can become a form of populism, which undermines the institutions necessary for rule of law and the appropriate balance of power between the executive, legislative and judicial arms of society. Above all, participatory democracy challenges the way societies are governed and makes the responsibility of governing perhaps more difficult, and it's becoming more transparent. It's something I think we need to have a good discussion about. To this I would add another movement, the way in which women's leadership is reaching a tipping point in many parts of the world, allied to the recognition of the importance of educating girls and women for the development of countries as a whole. And this movement and this sense was well captured in the report of the high-level panel on sustainability, Resilient People, Resilient Planet, a future worth choosing. I know that we will be looking at that high-level panel later, but I just wanted to quote the one part, because there's quite a lot on gender equality, but one, I think, striking paragraph as follows. Any serious shift towards sustainable development requires gender equality. Half of humankind's collective intelligence and capacity is a resource we must nurture and develop for the sake of multiple generations to come. The next increment of global growth could well come from the full economic empowerment of women. And I think many of us are not just heartened, but excited about the way in every region, in every country, and at every level, women are asserting their right to participate. Girls are beginning to understand that they should be treated equally to boys. And this, I think, is a very positive development. So how do we build on the notion of a more participatory democracy by having some kind of structures of accountability that enable civil society groups, individuals, academics, etc., to measure how they are governed? I just want to refer to two possible models that I think could be useful to our discussions. The first is the way in which African countries are now being measured in their governance. The work that has been done by the Ebrahim Foundation. I've had the honor to serve on the board and the prize committee of the Ebrahim Foundation from the beginning. And we have developed the index, the Ebrahim Index of African governance. It's available for those of you who want to check out in more detail at the website is www.moebrahimfoundation.org. And there's a very detailed analysis of the 53 and now to be 54 countries of Africa. We started with countries of sub-Saharan Africa, now it covers all African countries. And because we've had a number of years of the index, and this year's index will be published later in the year, you can see trends. You can see poor post-conflict countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone coming steadily up the index. You can see other countries going down quite rapidly, either because of conflict or other factors. But the measurement looks at human development, looks at issues of poverty, looks at issues of participation in human rights. In fact, we were able to show on the index that the countries where the Arab Spring movement began were countries where you had quite high human development, but not at a global level, GDP development, but lack of participation, lack of human rights, and therefore a disconnect between the overall economy and how people were feeling in the country. And in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, that came through on the index. So I've had a number of conversations with somebody who'll be well known to most of you in the room, a fellow citizen of this country and the former president of this country, Marty Atasari, who's also on the prize committee of the Ebrahim Foundation. And we have discussed the possibility of having a similar index in European countries, or Latin American countries, or Asian countries, so that there's a way to measure the performance of government. And there's a way for countries to see where they rank in relation to their near neighbours. And there's a way for civil society and business and others in countries to see how their countries are governed. A second model, which is somewhat along the same lines, which I've also had some involvement in, is the World Justice Project. This is a gathering of organizations led in large part by the American Bar Association, the International Bar Association, but it also includes engineers, nursing associations, wider groups who recognize the need to promote rule of law more actively and to tackle corruption in countries. And there is a rule of law index which applies to quite a large number of countries. So one of the things I hope that we can discuss and maybe find good ground to work on and advance is how we can build on the notion of democratic, participatory democracy, which is an important development, but do so in a way that provides the necessary tools to measure, because if you can't measure, then you can't judge. One of the points that was made from the floor this morning was about solidarity. I think it's very sad to see that the solidarity of a commitment made 40 years ago now by developed countries, the industrialized countries, to commit to 0.7% of their GDP has not been realized. Only 5 countries have reached that target currently, and the average is about 0.32 rather than 0.7, 0.32 after 40 years. So we don't see a level of solidarity that would have been welcome. We also see a rise in inequality both within countries and between countries. Great disparities between rich and poor, and this was something that I was conscious of having just come from a working visit to India with some of my fellow elders. The elders who've been brought together by Nelson Mandela are very focused on child marriage as one of our priorities, and we were in India last week and went to a rural part of Bihar to look at the situation there, and saw in a country that has high GDP the reality of poverty on the ground. And just before we arrived, the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Singh, had spoken at the 12th Delhi Sustainable Development Summit. And I just want to point to 2 paragraphs of what he said, because they are going to, I think, be extraordinarily important in the coming years, how we find an equity in the approach to sustainable development, including the impacts of climate change. He said, there's also a growing realization that sustainable development is not something that can be achieved by countries acting individually. The threat of climate change caused by greenhouse gas emissions has brought the world to a critical point where the actions of each and every country affect the planet as a whole. Sustainable development in this environment, therefore, calls for cooperation of all countries, both industrialized and developing. That cooperation must be based on the foundation of a right to development and the need for an equitable distribution of burden. The need for equity is starkly reflected in the fact that the emissions per capita in industrialized countries are 10 to 12 times those of developing countries. We know that total emissions in the world must decline, but what does this imply for emissions in individual countries? We must find a way of solving this problem in a way that doesn't deprive developing countries of their right to develop. And I think this is going to be one of the really key issues, because the international community's response to climate change is another example of a deficit in leadership. And this is an area that I'm particularly working on now with a foundation in Ireland called the Mayor Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice. The concept of climate justice involves linking human rights and development to achieve a human-centred approach, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and its resolution equitably and fairly. So climate justice is a human rights-based approach to combating climate change, which seeks equitable outcomes to both protect the vulnerable and provide access to benefits arising from our transition to low-carbon development. Obviously, climate change is a complex and multifaceted problem, and its far-reaching impacts on every part of the world as it hits the poorest countries and peoples hardest. So I believe that a climate justice approach is the only way to tackle this grave problem. And you'll recall that the Helsinki Process rightly included an environmental basket among the challenges to our globalized world. And the final report called for, and I quote, more discussion on the elements of an ethics-based climate change regime in preparation for a decision on long-term cooperation in addressing the challenge of climate change. Now, there have already been some comments on the recent Durban conference. I spent the whole period practically of the Durban conference in Durban, because we started with women's leadership. We started with the Foreign Minister of Mexico, Patricia Espinosa, handing over the chair to the Foreign Minister of South Africa, Maite Mashaban, and both of them speaking about women's empowerment and leadership, because they were part of a troika of women leaders. The troika having reflected that in Copenhagen, Connie Hedegaard had been the first woman president. And one of the people who helped greatly to form that troika of women's leadership was in fact a man who's present in this room, the Mexican ambassador, Luis de Alba. He helped to form a meeting in Cancun where we launched the Troika. And this is perhaps a good example of the kind of women's leadership. But what really struck me very much in Durban was that the politics of climate change was kind of turned on its head. We had too high expectations going into Copenhagen. And the feeling was that if the G20 countries could be brought to an agreement on mitigation, etc., that this would allow us to have a Big Bang agreement. It didn't happen. There was the much less effective Copenhagen Accords, and then following a very big year of diplomatic effort, Mexico brought the process back under the UN system and still left difficult decisions for Durban, especially what would happen to the Kyoto Protocol. And most people, I think, going to Durban went with quite a lot of apprehension as to what the outcome would be. I believe that the outcome was really more than many of us felt would be the case, because there is now an agreement. And the agreement came about because interesting alliances were formed. And the most interesting alliance was between the EU, the least developed countries, and the small island developing states. And it was that alliance that actually called the tune in Durban, because it grew to over 120 states. And then the host country, South Africa, agreed, and afterwards Brazil said we must be on the side also, and then China and India came in. So it was really very interesting. I think there's something profoundly encouraging about what happened in Durban, about the way in which power actually worked. And what they have agreed to is to develop, and I quote the three forms of this precisely, they're going to develop a new protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force by 2015. All countries, therefore, are agreeing that they will be in one legal agreement under one of those legal forms. That is a huge undertaking. It requires that we, for the first time, would have to look at core climate justice issues such as equity, as the right to development, and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. These issues have been dodged, they have been fudged, they have not actually been addressed. And now there is this commitment within a 4-year period that we would have an agreement which all countries would participate in. It seems to me that with a multi-stakeholder approach of the Helsinki process, this is an area that could be engaged in. It could use different energies of the country friends of the process, of the civil society friends of the process, of the business. This is something that is new enough to be a real challenge. It may be that it will be too much of a challenge. Certainly, the date for it coming into effect, 2020, seems very late. But the real challenge would be to get that agreement. So let me conclude by just reiterating my own support for the process that we all subscribe to, this multi-stakeholder process, and for the way in which the Helsinki process has brought diverse countries and individuals and viewpoints together. I think that's one of the most refreshing things, is that we do come from different backgrounds. I believe that we could play a very significant role in deepening participatory democracy by creating better forms of measuring government that allow for greater participation in how that government is measured and held to account. And I believe that we could play a role, not least in the Durban Climate Agreement. I also feel, but that will be the subject of the next conversation, that the 56 recommendations of the high-level panel, resilient people, resilient government, resilient people, anyway, that report form another agenda that could possibly be advanced by this multi-stakeholder approach. So I'm somebody, Erke, who sees the glass as half full. No, maybe not half full, but there's something in it, and I want to build on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, the first woman president of Ireland, the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the founder and the president of Realizing Rights. She's also a member of the elders, and she now serves as president of the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice. And she was also, as she said, a member of the Helsinki Group. We thank you so much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Martin Khor. This is the executive director of the South Center. Martin Khor joined the South Center as executive director in 2009. Prior to this, he was the director of the Third World Networking and also a member of the Helsinki Group. Martin Khor.
Thank you, Minister Bernard and Minister Erke. And good morning to all friends and colleagues. We are so happy to come back again. It's as if the break did not take place. I think events of the last 4 to 5 years since we last really met have shown and reaffirmed the need for the Helsinki process that was created in order to bridge the divide between North and South, to build the foundation for long-term international cooperation, to bring us together to reflect in a safe haven, far away from negotiations and so on the burning issues of the day and on the long-term fundamental issues of today and tomorrow. I think that was, if I'm not wrong, you are the two founders. This was the fundamental reason why Helsinki process began. Many issues that were picked upon 10 years ago and 5 years ago in Helsinki 1 and 2 have proven relevance in the test of time. Globalization, the global economy, global governance, democracy, climate change. These issues are needed for discussion even more today than when we discussed them in the first 2 phases. What we need is to update ourselves on the issues as well as on the state of the world discussions or negotiations on them. There was one big weakness of the Helsinki process. and that is that the button called pause, P-A-U-S-E, was hit on. So there is a break of 3 to 4 years. If the process had continued, then it would have been even stronger, and today we would be better placed to face so many of the problems. When we start a new process, the initial 3 to 4 years is experimentation, getting to know you, and so on. And in the second phase, it went into some action. We saw the results that Ambassador Ilari showed to us. And then there was a break. We all know why there was a break. And now the break is over. We have to come back to the game with renewed vigor, and probably we have to work double in order to make up for the break. So we thank our two ministers for convening this meeting again. And we need, at this meeting, this 2-day meeting, to reaffirm our political commitment to the foundations of this process and to see how creatively we can move ahead. Since we last met, some new things have happened to prove the value of what preoccupied us. The financial crisis of 2008, 2009 that has rolled on till now. This is new. I wish we had a Helsinki process that could have tracked and followed and countered and addressed it. But now we are meeting, we can do it. Secondly, the worsening of the climate crisis that has made it to the top of the global agenda. Thirdly, the Arab Spring and the spring in other places that reminds us that the spirit of democracy and self-determination not only lives on, but demands to be heard and to burst through the constraints. And finally, now we are meeting in Europe. We have the European crisis, maybe the last place in the world we expected the financial crisis to reach, sparking the intense debate on national economic policy, on regional and international governance, and so on. We certainly don't want to see the breakup of Europe. Although I'm not a European, I also belong to the European dream, that countries can come together in regional cooperation and can strengthen that regional cooperation, as Helsinki has tremendously helped to do in terms of bridging the East-West divide. And we don't want Western Europe, which is the strength of that divide, to somehow break up. But then, as in a marriage, you have the excitement of romantic entanglement, and then you get into the years of building that marriage, and you have new children, you bring in Eastern Europe and so on. But somehow you have a midlife crisis, which is good because it has to come. So hopefully it will be overcome one way or another. But realism tells us that it may get worse before it gets better. The Helsinki process reminds us of the need for global discussion, cooperation, actions across normal and not normal mechanisms. The strength of this process is the broad range of issues, the broad range of stakeholders, and the multi-dimensional action involved. That is vision, thinking, talking, and action, as well as mechanisms for action. This is the dream of the Helsinki process. It is only partly realized. It was paused, and this is the task that we have to continue and have to bring and to advance. Now, some of the issues that we face in the current situation. The first is globalization. That was a hot topic of Helsinki 1 and 2. It's still a major issue, but we have matured in our understanding of globalization. The face of globalization is changing, or our understanding of it. When Helsinki 1 took place, we brought up, many of us, concerns against the effects of extreme liberalization that every country was asked to liberalize, and our concern for market fundamentalism at the national and global scale. This was really what had concerned us, and we were trying to put in caution. We were trying to show examples from the ground of adverse effects when liberalization goes wrong, although there can be positive effects when it goes right. Now our concerns have been proven. There has been an implosion of the financial system, and we need to rein in finance. We need to tame finance. We need to tame the financiers. We thought we were beginning to do it, but they have come back with a vengeance. If you read some of the Helsinki books that are on the table, you will see a paper by Ann Pettifer. We thought she would write about debt, but she wrote about the dangers of financial liberalization, derivatives, and so on. So we were ahead of the curve. We were just saying, people thought she was mad. Stick to debt. Why do you go on to derivatives? And of course, today we say, well, you know, we won about it. The issues of trade continue. In Helsinki 1 and 2, many of us were warning against the dangers of over-liberalization of trade, particularly for poor countries under structural adjustment, and to some extent WTO. These lessons were partly learned. For example, in the Doha round, LDCs are told they don't have to reduce their tariffs. This is a recognition that over-reduction of tariffs when you are poor can damage you, as it has damaged many countries. But we have not fully learned that lesson. For example, in the Economic Partnership Agreement that the European Commission is forcing onto Africa, I chose my word carefully, is the European Commission rather than the European Union countries. That commission has a trade directorate which is totally ideological, unlike our friends' experience in the World Bank, that the research department was a wonderful campus. In the commission, it's not a campus, it's very action-oriented, and it's forcing through a model that has already died elsewhere. It died in the WTO. But we are forcing the LDCs in Africa to sign on to a trade agreement where they have to cut their tariffs to zero for 80% of products, open up in financial liberalization through an investment chapter, and in a procurement chapter, open up the government business to foreign competition, etc., etc. So this is something that the African countries have tried to fight. The African Union has come out with its own alternative to the EPA, and that is that the African countries be given everything but arms, and not just the LDCs. They are trying to bring this paper of theirs, which has been endorsed by the African trade ministers and the African heads of states, actually, but they do not know how to bring this to the attention of European member states, the European Commission or the G20. And this is where a mechanism like the Helsinki Process could help out. Another emerging risk in the trade and globalization area is the opposite of our caution against liberalization, and this is the emerging risk of protectionism and new protectionism, particularly as Europe and America faces rising unemployment and politicians who have to fight for their job. They tend to blame the poor countries for stealing their jobs. So this is the old debate which is now coming back with a vengeance. You see it in the fight for the US presidential elections. And this is something that we need to address as well. In other words, whilst globalization remains an issue and even a problem, we need to rethink what that problem is and how to address it. And then secondly, we have the economic crisis of 2008 and its renewal in 2011. In Europe, recovery was replaced by the downturn and a probable recession. The 2008 crisis was very sharper than now, but it rebounded very fast because of the coordinated action of the G20 in Keynesian policies. But now we have a slowdown and the extreme fear about the effects of debt, both in the US and in Europe. And now we have counter-cyclical, we have pro-cyclical policies, which are not Keynesian policies, which means that we are likely to have a slowdown in the global economy for the next 2 to 3 or even 4 years. May not be as sharp as -4 to 5%, but may be flat as in 0%, but over a longer period of time. So what happens is that the developing countries who had suffered tremendously in the 2009 recession, but saw their commodity prices and so on bounding back, a renewed inflow of capital flows, a recovery of their export earnings, and a recovery to some extent of their GNP will probably face in the next 3 to 4 years a much more difficult time than 2009. And many poor countries may face a situation where they may fall into debt again because of the collapse of their export earnings and the running out of their reserves. On the global governance stage in the global economy, we have seen the rise of the G20. This was in the last 3 to 4 years since we last met. And we saw an effort at the United Nations to have a conference of the G196 on the global economy. There is a working group at the UN, but it has not been very active because developed countries were not very keen to activate it. We don't have a proper global forum to discuss the economic crisis unless you belong to the G20, and most of us do not belong to the G20. So there is a need for a global forum where all countries can come together and discuss. If the euro, for example, gets into very serious trouble, what are the effects on the rest of the world? Where do we discuss this? We are not able to, unless you're a member of the G20, and it doesn't meet all the time either. How to reform the G20 so that it is more democratic? Or how do we set up a UN Economic Council that is able to absorb the G20 but is also able to extend to other countries? Do we build the UN General Assembly working group into something like an economic council? Or can we build an economic sub-commission as part of a new council on sustainable development coming out of Rio+20? Because if the powers that be do not allow the UN to have an economic council, they may allow the UN to have a sustainable development council with a strong pillar on the economy that cannot be the council, but can be a committee on global economy. In other words, we need a multilateral forum to discuss the global economy, and we still don't have it. And I think this is one of the tasks of the Helsinki process, to identify where global governance is absent and to try to build it up, where it is present but not done properly, to try to correct it, and so on. In any case, Helsinki 3 must have the global economy as part of its major theme, and I'm happy that the organizers have put it as one of the 2 themes, the other being sustainable development. On trade, we have the impasse of the Doha round. I've been following this almost on a day-to-day basis, long before it became the Doha round. The reasons are very complex and interesting. We have the text of December 2008 that could be the basis for conclusion. Almost all countries believe that we could conclude on that basis. I myself think that those 2 texts on agriculture and NAMA are still very imbalanced against the developing countries. In other words, if it was to conclude, the developed countries would actually reap much more benefits than the developing countries, mainly because the commitments on agriculture are not really effective. Although it is said that agricultural subsidies are going to be reduced, in actual fact, not so. It will be reduced in some areas, but it can increase in other areas, as we have seen in the European Common Agricultural Policy. Nevertheless, the United States, in its wisdom, has decided that it doesn't want to conclude this round. Even objectively, from our point of view, it would benefit from it. So it has thrown in such outrageous demands on major developing countries that they know would be rejected, that the round is now at an impasse. We need to think through the future of the multilateral trading system, and we need to give back the WTO decoupled from Doha, or to be able to conclude Doha in some way or other. And in the meanwhile, not introduce new issues again into the WTO that would further complicate the matter, so that in the end we will not solve the agriculture problem, which is the real problem of distortion and ill effects on developing countries, by introducing new issues that will then really complicate the multilateral trading system. So what is the future of multilateral trading system? what is the appropriate approach to multilateral trade rules and international trade is another subject that Helsinki could possibly take on. And I mentioned just now about the dangers of the FTAs. This is another big issue for most developing countries. This is the issue rather than WTO, especially the poorer countries. And the importance here is that the European Commission has come out with a proposal to withdraw GSP and GSP plus preferences except for the very poor countries, and therefore spilling this into a crisis for countries such as Kenya or Nigeria or Ghana that are not LDCs formally, but are very close to LDCs, but may lose all their preferences unless they sign on to an EPA that they don't want to sign on to, and which if they sign on to would break the regional unity of African countries at the sub-regional and regional level. This is something that we feel the politicians and the public in European countries don't fully understand what the European Commission is doing in your name. On another issue, which is sustainable development, the second major theme of this conference that the organizers have put forward, we have the environment crisis, climate, water, energy, agriculture, and food. On climate, we all know that the world, whatever that means, the world needs big emission cuts. The sooner, the better. But how it is going to cut it? Through which technologies? Who is going to cut? Which countries and by how much? Where are the means of implementation, especially finance and technology? These are the unsettled issues. As Mary Robinson has said, we now have a Durban platform, but we don't have the terms of reference for that Durban platform. The terms of reference have to be filled up this year, if possible, and at least by next year. So we have fierce battles ahead. Durban has not solved the problem. It has just asked the question and provided a platform. So the word platform is very suitable. Do we settle it on the basis of equity, as Mary Robinson has suggested? You said that in the forefront you have to have equity and reaffirm common and differentiated responsibility as we distribute the efforts on emission reduction? Or do we throw out equity and treat every country on the same basis, which of course would be unfair? Countries like Tanzania with 0.2 tons cannot be treated the same way as the United States with 25 tons. But if that is going to be the position of the United States, and hopefully not Europe, then we have a real crisis on our hands. If we do take equity, then on what basis do we take equity? And how do we resolve the problem of the United States that says we definitely do not want equity, we don't want the firewall between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1? How do we persuade the United States to play ball? And even if you persuade the US administration, how can you persuade the US Congress? I think these are very, very huge issues on which the future of the world is going to be decided. We have a Green Climate Fund, but issues of governance have not yet been settled properly. The achievement was at least we did set it up in Durban. So congratulations to all of you who took part in it, and some of you in this room, we have been having discussions and so on. We need to now fill up this fund with the governance properly and with the concept of fair burden sharing in the North. We have the same problem again. If the US does not want to put in money, will Europe still put in money anyway? This is just one of the issues. And most difficult of all, what do we do with the fund in terms of using the money between adaptation, mitigation, between different countries, and so on? The water crisis is probably on an immediate basis as serious or more serious than the climate crisis, although the two are interrelated. We can't survive 2 to 3 days without water. We have won a major victory in the right to water being now recognized, both by the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. How do we operationalize this right? And how do we stop the continued great wastage of water and the fact that many people do not have access to water, a problem that is going to accentuate even more? And how do we prevent water from becoming a new basis of war. I think we need major effort on the waterfront. On energy, you know what the issue is, both the environmental problems associated with fossil fuels, the need to promote renewables, and how do we make sure that the poorest people in the world, 2 billion people that don't have access to energy, manage to get that energy. What do we do with fossil fuels? If we use up fossil fuels, then the world is doomed. If we don't use fossil fuels anymore, how do we compensate for those countries that have fossil fuels? We have not managed to solve this problem. And if we don't, then the world is also doomed. And then we have agriculture and food security. It has to be tackled from a sustainable development point of view. You have the economic issues of some countries providing massive subsidies and selling to poor countries at below cost price, therefore damaging the self-sufficiency of food, especially in Africa. This continues. Can Africa allow itself to raise its tariff to defend itself from predatory dumping of food onto their ground? They can. They were prevented by the World Bank and IMF, but no more. Yet we do not use tariff because it is seen as something which is very bad. What do we do about the lack of investment in agriculture? About the environment? Do we go for organic farming and sustainable agriculture, or do we go the genetic engineering route that some are promoting? I think these are very key issues in that whole complex of food security. And of course, we have biodiversity and forest issues that you know very well about. So on this issue, I want to end on the concept and the negotiations on sustainable development. Sustainable development is an opportunity to integrate the 3 pillars, social, environmental, and economic, as well as to bring in the North-South equity dimension. And this was, of course, the major achievement of the Rio Principles and the Rio Summit, that it took a comprehensive, integrative approach. Now we have Rio Plus 20, and today we will listen more in the afternoon to this. The weakness of Rio, the first Rio, was that the institutional framework that was created, that looked very well at that time, the Commission on Sustainable Development, was too weak in capacity and profile. It was allowed to meet only 2 to 3 weeks a year. We now have to think of how to upgrade the profile and maybe convert the Commission into a council, the same way we did for human rights, so that this council can meet, can have meetings for 250 days in the year. And that's what happened to human rights. And this is what raised the profile of human rights. In Geneva, we used to have a human rights month. Now we have a human rights year every year. You walk into the UN and this or that committee of human rights is taking place. We don't have this for sustainable development. We have a CSD that meets 2 weeks in a year. So a very important issue with like sustainable consumption and production or forests or whatever it is has to take turns and is discussed once every 4 or 5 years. That's ridiculous. Even on climate change, where we should be negotiating every day of the year, it's so crazy that we have to fight and say, let's have another intersessional meeting of 1 week, and where do we find the money? Even the Green Climate Fund, which is supposed to be $100 billion, had only 9 to 10 days to meet to design that fund. It should have had 4 months at least straight negotiations in order to meet. So if we do set up a council, and there are many issues to resolve the relationship of that to the ECOSOC, does it relate directly to the to the General Assembly? How do you have the 3 pillars in balance? The main issue to me is that it should meet 250 days in a year. It should have a center, either New York or Geneva. It can have many subcommittees that will be the basis of these meetings, and there will be very active negotiations. Each mission will have 3 to 5 people full-time dealing with sustainable development, as they do for WTO or human rights. And I think this is something that we could set in motion in Rio Plus 20, at least give the political commitment, and then have a negotiation on the nuts and bolts in the next 1 year. Finally, we have an impulse impasse. This was a Freudian slip. I wish we had an impulse for multilateral cooperation. We do in this room, but there is an impasse out there. A deadlock in WTO, a deadlock in climate change, unless we break it, and a deadlock in sustainable development. United States, for example, is now disputing the principle of common and differentiated responsibility or special and differential treatment in the WTO. If we do so, there will be outcomes, but they will be weak, rhetoric, but meaningless. And the key issue to me that is causing this deadlock is the question whether developing countries are still developing countries or that the only developing countries are the LDCs. And especially countries like China, Brazil, India must be treated like developed countries. And unless you do so, we will not give special treatment to developing countries as a whole. We will do so provided some developing countries are no longer considered developing countries. I think this is an issue that has to be resolved, and Helsinki is a very good place to discuss it. Look at India, GDP per capita 1,400, number 132 out of 190 countries. India is, objectively speaking, the biggest LDC in this world, or maybe 50 LDCs combined into one. If we consider India to be a developed country, then almost all other developing countries have to be considered the same. Even China, GDP per capita 4,000, number 92 out of 190. In terms of per capita CO2, 5 tons, number 77 out of 170 countries. India, of course, is number 122 in terms of carbon dioxide. And then so on and so forth with Brazil, South Africa, and so on. Are the developing countries going to decouple during this financial crisis so that they continue to grow at 5 to 8% a year as Europe falls to 0%? I don't think so. The South Centre is coming out with a major paper on this. And our finding is that the big developing countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa are over-dependent on capital inflows because of huge trade deficits, and they are going to suffer from this crisis. Even a country like China is extremely dependent on exports to the West, and they are going to see their growth rate cut quite drastically. It is not clear that they will be able to make the shift to domestic-led demand based on consumption, because you have to shift the entire basis of society and so on. But there will be very difficult times for China as well. And for those countries that depend on China, Southeast Asia, that sells our components to China that goes into Western exports, Africa and Latin America that sells commodities to China, we will see our export demand also falling. In other words, the European crisis and the American crisis is not going to see the developing world spurting ahead and leaving Europe behind. The decline in Europe or America is going to see a decline in the developing country miracle as well, particularly those dependent on commodity prices. Where does this bring us on Helsinki Process 3? Number 1, scientific analysis and discussion on major global challenges as we have done this morning. Discussion on emergencies as they take place, keeping an eye on what is needed and to measure the deficiencies of what is being done. In other words, let's be realistic but not complacent. And we have 2 scenarios in front of us as to what we can do. The first, which is the most likely, do what is doable in the useful UN processes, UNFCCC, WTO, Rio Plus 20, 2015 MDG Phase 2, Sustainable Development Council, etc. These are things that we can go into. Many of us are involved one way or another, NGOs or governments, or international organizations such as mine. Strengthen it and make it turn into success from what would be failure or from weakness. We can do a good job on this. Even then, the prospects are not very bright as to what good job we can do, but that is something that we can see ourselves doing. The second is raise the level of ambition and the level of risk, and to do not only what we can do, but to do what we cannot do, but that we have to do. Go beyond addressing what is doable and go into what needs to be done. I think the first session where our friend from the former vice president of World Bank painted this gloomy picture, I think we all share this gloomy scenario, except that we say, well, things can be done in that first category of things that I told you about, international cooperation through the UN processes and so on. But we have to do even more than that. We have to do the impossible. We have to do what nobody else is doing. Because the doable is not good enough. How do we do it? What are the innovative mechanisms? Each of us have our constituencies. The strength of this process is that the NGOs are here, the social movements are here. I'm sure, Erkki, you will be inviting Occupy to come here next. I don't know whether you have an Occupy Finland. You can import the occupiers of London and New York here. It's a multi-stakeholder process.
Already among us.
Yeah? We are occupying Finland today. We have to provide that vision. We have to arm ourselves with information and analysis. We have to assert certain principles such as survival of humanity and Earth, the principle of equity and reducing inequality. The reduction of inequality is what is spurring ahead these young people in Occupy, as well as the young people in Egypt and elsewhere. We need the strong and the rich to help the weak and the poor, including giving up some of their privileges. These principles have to be then combined with action plans and mechanisms for implementing them. Is it doable? Of course not. Can it be done? Absolutely not. Would it need a miracle to do it? Even God cannot do it. And that is why we have to do it. Because it is impossible. If it was possible, we don't need to meet. So Finland and Tanzania, you are very appropriate countries to bring us together. You are not superpowers. You are ordinary powers. Finland is a second power, not in the first category of superpowers, but a very influential one with moral authority. Tanzania is an LDC. You are what our friend wrote about, the wretched of the earth. You are part of the wretched of the earth, and thereby have the moral authority to do something. And both governments have credibility. They are democratic. Not all governments are totally democratic, of course, because then you wouldn't be governments. You'll be an individual. But credible enough. You have two soon-to-be former presidents, Tarja Halonen, she's still the president, but not for long, and Ben Mkapa, who also happens to be chairman of the South Center. Very credible people who led the social dimensions of globalization and who are in great demand. You should pull them into the Helsinki process. We in the South Center, which is an organization of 52 developing countries, are very committed to help see the success of this process with all of you to do what we can do and to do what we absolutely cannot do as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We now have about half an hour before lunch for discussion, questions, comments. And I'd like to begin myself by making a few remarks because I have an interest in trying to protect the bank from being robbed before everybody has had the possibility to make their deposits. And I mean that although there were very interesting points about trade, investment in these introductions, I would hope that we save the discussion until tomorrow after I have had my opportunity to put in my deposit with some concrete ideas on these issues. And I'm sure that Heidi Hautala has the same interest regarding sustainable development, where she will be introducing later today those remarks. But I want to take up 2 points which I think are worth discussing. Well, one thing is to recall how the world has changed in 10 years. And one item being that even if that is already the case 10 years ago, it is certainly much more evident today, namely that we live in an interdependent world, and that we cannot regard other people's problems as not affecting us. And I had an eye-opening experience last September when we had, once again, the meeting of the 5 Nordic and 10 African foreign ministers, a very nice, very good institution without totally informal discussions. And the number one subject preoccupying our African colleagues was the crisis in Europe. And how are we going to deal with that? So we started with that, not with the usual agenda of African issues and African conflicts. We cannot isolate anyone's problems. We have to deal with them at one time. And what another aspect of this interdependence is, now that when I started my political career as a 1968 activist, the world was very clearly, so we thought, divided into 3. We had the first world, we had the second world, and we had the third world. But where are these worlds today? And the issue that Martin raised about how do we deal with countries which are at the same time both developing and both less developed countries. And so we cannot really look at the world as being simply divided into the G77 countries and the developed countries, because we have countries like China, like India, Brazil, which are both developing countries, certainly, by any criteria, but which are also becoming increasingly important donors of foreign aid. And obviously, we cannot overlook this development. What we need is a new approach to global governance also on this basis. And this brings me to the other item which Martin mentioned, and that is, what do we do with the G20? I think it is obvious that, and indeed, by the way, this was one of the points that the Helsinki Process already made, that we need some sort of G20 for better global governance. But the problem with today's G20 is that it lacks democratic legitimacy. It is a self-appointed forum, necessary, yes, because we all recognize that no G196 can function as such. There needs to be preparatory mechanisms for addressing global governance issues. But that has to be transparent, that has to be open, and that has to be democratic. And I have, both in office and out of office, on several occasions, put forward the idea that could we combine the Security Council reform, which we need, obviously, and a reform of the G20. If we had a reformed Security Council with perhaps 20 to 25 members, including the present permanent members, but new permanent members from all continents without new vetoes, but be sitting permanently at the... Couldn't this new reformed Security Council be also the new G20? Because then everybody would have, at least in principle, the possibility of being elected as an alternate member, rotating member to the Council. And everybody would be in the same position. And the Security Council members have already a full-time network in New York. They have to keep in contact. So why not use this as the basis for a new, more legitimate G20? Obviously, it cannot bypass the international organizations. Any treaties need to be ratified by everyone. Any new agreements have to be also adopted by the international organizations where everybody is present, yes, but we need some sort of leadership. It has to be more open and democratic than the present G20. So I just throw this as an idea which we could also discuss. It is not self-evidently the only answer to the need for better global governance, but it is, at least could be, a part of the answer on how to deal with the present problems with the present G20. I just mentioned this as some items and trying to preserve the bank until until everybody has made their deposits, then it can be robbed open. I already see several people asking for the floor, starting with Irene, please.
I'm actually struck by one factor, one particular actor that has not got much attention. We've been talking about multi-stakeholder dialogue, we've been talking about changes that have taken place since our conversation first began. And that's the private sector, the corporates, you know, who in many cases actually are more powerful even than governments today. And when you see European governments negotiating with bankers about how to deal with the euro crisis, then you wonder about the democratic deficit and how it's actually turned entirely. And to me it seems that any future Helsinki process has to take into account those actors. They are also stakeholders in the planet, in preserving the planet, in building economic growth, in benefiting from it, like anyone else. So I think that that is one actor that I would have liked, and I would ask Mary in particular, when she was speaking about democracy, yes, citizens have become more engaged, but civil society today is, you know, where does business fit into society? And particularly, of course, there is also growth of social business. So there are many, many different ways in which people are now addressing some of these problems, and how do we bring those kinds of innovations into our conversation?
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I'd like to bring the point of, yes, thank you. I'm Matti Kohonen from the Tax Justice Network. Many of the proposals today have looked at increasingly addressing issues by a lot of money being required to address the global problems, but there's been a lack of discussion of the revenue side on how this money will be raised. And I think that's part of the inspiration of the Occupy movement, of who is going to pay for the crisis. Is it the people? Is it the bankers? Or is it somebody else? And in this case, the Tax Justice Network has been looking at tax evasion, tax havens, and tax competition as where the money has went. We estimate that 11.5 trillion US dollars, equivalent of US annual GDP, is held offshore tax havens beyond the reach of tax authorities, both north and south. That creates a tax loss of annually 255 billion US dollars. That would be already contributing a long way to pay for the crisis. We estimate there are at least 60 tax havens, which we list in the Financial Secrecy Index. Cayman Islands has become the world's 5th largest financial center, and they largely deal in very high-risk derivatives and hedge funds, which don't pay taxes where they are then used. Illicit financial flows are estimated by Global Financial Integrity in Washington, D.C. to be at 1.26 trillion US dollars annually from global south to global north. This includes money that is transacted, used, or earned illegally. Much of this is corporate tax dodging. 30% is criminal, 5% is bribery, and most of the efforts to tackle illicit flows have looked at tackling bribery in the World Bank. Some have looked at tackling criminality, and nearly none of the efforts have looked at tackling corporate tax dodging. So my answer to the glass being half full or half is that the glass has been stolen. Because the money is there, but the money has flown offshore. The money has been competed between countries that are offering ever-increasing tax exemptions on investments, special economic zones, export processing zones that are promoted by the World Bank, for instance, as a way to grow your economy, but they forgot that there is no social benefit from growth unless it's taxed and well spent on social development. And some of our proposals link to this and to the UN system as well as part of the package of solutions is that we would require there to be automatic tax information exchange, which would be a better model than the current OECD model of on-request exchange. It's ridiculous that we only have And Jersey signs a tax information exchange treaty with Finland, but there haven't been any requests made. And that's because the process of making these requests on whether Finns have accounts in Jersey, and Jersey has signed very few agreements with developing countries, is very hard. It's very hard to get information. So we would like that to be automatic. So every country could ask Jersey whether you have corporate or private bank accounts. Second is country-by-country reporting. Corporations need to be more transparent about their activities. Tell us how much you pay tax in every country where you operate, how much you have assets, what is your employment expenditure, and what is your debt in each country. And you'll discover that there are huge amounts of profits in the Cayman Islands, but there's no employment there. So there has to be something going on within the accounts of the companies. And a statistic which is often forgotten in trade is that 60% of world trade is intra-company trade, according to the OECD, depending on sector, depending on industry. But this intercompany trade is the least regulated part of world trade, and it is the most secretive part of world trade. And this is where companies engage in practices of transfer mispricing, which you shift profits to least taxed areas, and to thin capitalization and other tax tricks. And if you remember Mitt Romney's tax share, he was 15%, and his secretary was paying over 30% of tax. And that's because he was a private equity manager and a hedge fund manager. So, I've talked a lot, but indicators, there was a question about indicators. Tax per GDP is a social development indicator. There's no social development without the growth being taxed. So we would like that to be in the post-MDG framework of sustainable development, and we'd like that to be counted in every country in a very detailed manner, because within the tax per GDP, direct tax is even more effective because you tax people proportionally to their wealth. And financial transparency is a second indicator which is crucial to knowing governance issues in a country. Does the country allow secret accounts? Now, in this matter, Europe is worse governed than Africa, because in Europe we have about 10 tax havens, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Monaco, and so forth, the Channel Islands, and they all allow secretive trusts or banking secrecy. Luxembourg being one of the largest financial centers in Europe in this respect. So those indicators are very important when we look beyond the MDGs to understand financial transparency, and here we have the Financial Secrecy Index already developed by the Tax Justice Network. One final point on tax competition. Countries compete on low tax rates. Unfortunately, for instance, in Europe, there's no agreement on common corporate tax base, or there's no agreement on any variation of corporate tax rates. And therefore, Ireland has one of the lowest tax rates in Europe with 12.5%, and it attracts businesses across Europe, but also it attracts, for instance, patents across the world. Where, for instance, Microsoft, when it pays a license fee, there's a company in Ireland, which is one of the largest companies in Ireland, and it's there only to collect royalties from Microsoft. So that sort of tax competition is eroding tax base. So the end of result is that ordinary people end up paying most of the crisis through indirect taxes such as the VAT, and the shifting tax burden from capital to labor has taken place in the last 30 years. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Raimo Väyrynen. I was an advisor to the Helsinki Process in the very early phases of it. Let me add one issue on the agenda, and that concerns inequality. We have a lot of evidence now in the world that among countries, inequality is actually declining a bit because of the rapid growth in populous countries like India and China, but it's increasing in almost all countries in the world. There are some exceptions like Brazil, where the Bolsa Familia program, for instance, has helped reduce inequality. But Brazil started from a very high level of inequality. We have to recognize that. And indeed, there are lots of reports from the World Bank, OECD, and other sources, Luxembourg Income Study Group, which corroborate the increasing inequality. Some of us may remember that an American economist called Herbert Okun wrote a paper in the early 1970s, actually it's a mathematical model, where he convinced the economic profession that inequality is good for growth, because it accumulates funds for people who take risks, invest, innovate, and so on and so forth. That conventional wisdom among the economists has evaporated these days, and you don't only need to name Paul Krugman, you can name lots of other people in that regard. So what can we do for the fact of increasing inequality, which has become a political issue? It's not only Indignados in Spain or Zucconi Park in New York. If someone had said 2 years ago that according to media, one of the major issues in Davos would be inequality, I think we have said that you have to go and have your head examined. But indeed, inequality was a major concern, according to media, in Davos. So can we do something about inequality, which is a concern, not only an economic one, but it certainly economic inequality correlates with social and educational inequality, even with gender equality. I'm afraid that we can't have a multilateral forum which would ban inequality or have it reduced. It doesn't work this way. Most of the decisions on economic policy are made at home in any case. But there might be one potential idea, and that's the kind of equality audit that might be connected with major economic agreements in the world. That as we have an environmental impact assessment, we might have an inequality assessment accompanied with, as I said, with the major economic agreements. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Again, I mean, there's some very interesting points put on the table, but I was going to take your lead and say, we'll have our issues out there that we want to take from the meeting later, but it would be very useful still to reflect a bit on the process and what's happened in the last 5-10 years since we met. And I mean, I've been struck by a number of things which have been said. I mean, is there a trade-off between the legitimacy and the efficiency of international institutions? Maybe perhaps it would be worth at least reflecting on that. Or is there a win-win system? I mean, I think there are some win-win points there. But I think one striking fact, I mean, building on the pessimism of Jean-François earlier, but I mean the three types of models we've had for economic coordination in the last 5 years have all failed pretty miserably, I mean, in one way or another. And what are the lessons we try and learn from that? I mean, the European Union is looking at a sort of a self-created sort of existential crisis, which, as a number of people have already said, has global implications, at least for one model of cooperation. You have to be optimistic and hope that that will actually work itself out. The climate change negotiations, paint a pretty dismal picture, I'm afraid, of where we are in the UN institutions, and we can get into a discussion from post-Durban, is it half full, half empty glass, but it's still extremely, extremely problematic compared to where we were. And on the G20 issues, I mean, the questions you just posed about how to increase legitimacy were ones very much, I think, on some of the organizations I was working with minds 2 years ago about, with the Stiglitz report, how do we build this into UN frameworks and so on so you increase legitimacy. Now the concern is that it's the inefficiency of the G20 which has clearly shifted away from some political will, to take action, which Anne Pettifor was referring earlier, towards a pretty low common denominator when you look at the the Mexican agenda this year. So I think one set of issues before we start, if you like, as you say, taking the money out of the bank and saying, well, we need to address this in this institution, is just, is that a trade-off? How do you get some win-win situations, and how do we use the sort of groups that we all represent here to try and break through some of those barriers in the current climate? Just two other quick points, really, just agreeing with what's already been said. I mean, I agree very much with Irene as well. I think one issue we were not able to engage in a serious way, I think, in the first Helsinki process, with business or bits of business or whatever. And we've seen, again, in a negative sense on financial regulation and other areas, just how, if you like, a financial lobby has been very effective in stopping government regulation. So some thinking about what that means for the future is important. But also to the extent to which, Martin presented as always a very convincing sort of presentation of issues, but it was still very much a nation-state-based model. And when you look essentially, in China, are we dealing with Western multinationals, or are we dealing with the Chinese government, or are we dealing with the Chinese people? I don't know. We are on lobbying sides, on different sides of the issues on some of those points. And, lastly, I just say, again, on the point of inequality, I think it's a horizontal issue which really has influenced the whole debate. And again, you can see this in lots of discussions, even at a national level, that the notion of some of the valid points that Martin is putting on the table about, India, the media says, well, there are more billionaires in India than there are in the UK. Why does it have developing country status? I think unless you actually tackle the issues of distribution within country and start to break down some of those questions, I think that's the notion of the welfare state and the notion of different states is not going to be sustainable.
Thank you. My name is Jenny Kauppila. I'm from the Citizens Global Platform. And actually, I first would like to thank you for the organizers for this wonderful opportunity to look at the different parts of the world. I think the key is really the path dependency, whether we choose the paths that are leading towards sustainability or towards social struggle that is bringing more inequity and the sort of all the crises that they were mentioned, biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, food crisis, and so on. However, we have all this shared vision, but the implementation has been the problem since already the first Rio. So for this purpose, I suggest that we, for example, look at the Arctic, the changing geopolitical situation now in very nearby to us, and the way that we are going to deal with the Arctic is a very good indicator how well we do in terms of renewing the global governance, whether we are going for the sustainable path or whether we are going for the unsustainable path. Because if we do go for the unsustainable path, we are going for all these things mentioned by Jean-Francois. The extraction of the last resources at the expenses also of the indigenous people and the other inhabitants of these areas. So do we have some mechanism to incorporate this new governance question to the reform of the, let's say, whether it's the reform of G20 and the Security Council reform? Because already, for example, in the Arctic Council, India and China have expressed their interest to be part of the process. So I just throw this as a practical indicator how well we do in terms of shared vision for the governance.
Thank you. My name is Chutinthorn Gongsakdi. I'm from the Thai government. I'm going to sit down now. I just have one comment and one fairly basic point. The first comment is that as we are a friend of the Helsinki Process, and we were the facilitator for the issue of human trafficking. So I have to own up that here's one of the issues that we haven't haven't solved the problem, and if anything, it's worse. But one of the things that is there in concrete is the multi-stakeholder approach. And the Helsinki Process, we organized an activity, a seminar, and for us that helped lay the groundwork for our own multi-stakeholder approach to combating human trafficking. Now the other point, which I feel is quite basic, but maybe it needs to come from our region,
the topic is globalization and democracy, right? But democracy overall has been positive influence. There's now multi-stakeholder participation in the UN, in the UN mechanisms, especially in human rights. So they have a voice, the stakeholders. In Thailand, in my own country, there's more democracy. But more democracy has also led to more disruption. You know, the kinds of things that my colleague from Kenya mentioned this morning, that people have come to know democracy and then they want to have their voice. But how do you channel that positively, you know, into governance? So I guess what I'm saying is that one of the basic building blocks is nationhood and nation building. And this is something that the Helsinki Process papers, I grabbed one from the back on building democracy. It was written in 2005, but the recommendations which start from page 173 are very relevant. I mean, my own country, we've ticked a lot of things on the list, but there are new nations emerging every day. You know, I mean, you turn on the TV, and they need help. I also speak. Well, I can't speak on behalf of Myanmar, but since we're neighbors, you know, we know that Myanmar wants help with nation building, as with us. You know, I mean, how do we deal with democracy? How do we transform from a country that looks, you know, like a democracy to a country like Finland, where everyone seems to be pleased, you know, with the system, and that they're quite satisfied that their needs and wants and aspirations are reflected, you know. So that's one of the difficulties that we need to think about in the world, which is nation building and how you can build capacity for that. That's why we have proposed capacity building on human rights, you know, as a resolution in the Human Rights Council. There's also a role for regionalism, so EU in Europe, ASEAN, our own association in Southeast Asia, Arab League in Syria, for example. So I suppose as nations emerge, you know, when you talk about global governance, they want to play a bigger role in the world, you know, in G20 and so on and so forth. And it's an imperfect world, and usually it means that if you can get yourself in, while not everybody is in there, that's it's you know, that's better, you know. Like Singapore has gotten into G20 because I read that they hosted a G3 meeting, and because the G3 made its voice heard, then Singapore should be invited, and so on and so forth. From the perspective of Southeast Asia, as long as ASEAN, you know, our equivalent of the EU, is there, we're okay, and we have to be satisfied with that. But I recognize that there are a lot of other countries that would like to be part of that decision-making process. So I guess I'm saying, don't forget to invest in the basic building block, basic fundamental building block of democratic nation building, okay? Because that underpins everything that you say from the beginning till the end of the conference. And I still think that the Helsinki process, the people that are represented in this room, is a good model, you know, for how we need to carry on global governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Once again, I have to say that there are at least half a dozen requests for the floor, but our time is running out, and I want to give our two panelists the opportunity to respond to this. But we will continue again later this afternoon. So, do you want to maybe begin?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'll respond specifically to the question that Irene raised, and rightly, I think, about the corporate sector, that we need to you know, have a sense of the power and the role of the corporate sector in our world. And I think there was an interesting part answer from the Tax Justice Network representative. But I think it's worth noting that since we started the Helsinki process, there's also been the John Ruggie's work on the guidelines on business and human rights. that apply in a framework of protect, respect and remedy, a duty on states to protect people from violations of their rights by corporations, non-state actors, but it means corporations in that context, and the fact that that duty is now expressly recognised. Secondly, the responsibility of all corporations to respect all human rights. So it's a new way of holding to account that I think will be increasingly interesting, and the need for more effective remedies in that way. I have to say, for me, the role of the corporate sector in the United States at the moment in these pacts of huge money to affect the process is actually very corrupting. I don't know why the word corruption isn't used in describing it, because it's profoundly corrupt, and it's very worrying, and it's unfortunately been now given a whole new life by that recent judgment of the Supreme Court. It really is very sad, because when you have that money power for negative advertising, money power for the, it just undermines the whole idea of democracy. And so I think it is right that we keep the corporate sector very much in mind, and also the potential of the corporate sector to support, for example, the Millennium Development Goals and other issues. I do agree that we need to recognise the increasing inequality in most countries, and that this is causing huge social, not only discontent but distrust, as I said. I'm a little bit disappointed that there wasn't any take-up on the point I was making about the need we have. If we're going to have more participatory democracy, then it can't be a vote every 4 or 5 years. That's not enough now. People want to be able to participate and be involved in how they are governed and how decisions are taken about them. And so I think that we need to look at really interesting models, and some of them are measuring how we're being governed in ways that are now available because we have more and more data that can be measured. And so, as I mentioned, the Ebrahim Index and the World Justice Project's work on Rule of Law Index, but also we're going to have more sort of consultation processes, because people will want to be consulted on decisions that affect them. And we have the means to do this now through the new technologies. People are connected and want to be connected with how they're governed. And I think that this is both. This is actually quite it's a way of renewing and countering the democratic deficit, both within countries and at a more regional and global level, by building in more accountability mechanisms that relate to people feeling that they are able to have an input in decisions affecting them, that they are able to measure the role of governments in relation to them. And I think we should see this as being something that the Helsinki process can contribute to.
I think the issue of the corporate sector is very important. Some time ago, when they said that the NGOs plus corporate sector, and then they should be treated the same way, and that's how the UN has treated it. Some of us said actually it's not so. We are NCOs. We have the non-corporate sector, and that's the NGOs and the government. And the private sector is outside there. So I think in the Helsinki process, we need to talk about the role of corporations, corporate power, the need for regulating them, and to set up international and global systems for regulating them. This is the time. If we don't do it now, I don't see which other time when it has already been proven that at least the financial part of the corporate sector is responsible for so much damage. But then it's not them, it's us who allowed them to do it through our deregulation and so on. So how do we capture back the role of the state and the role of people in regulating and in governing the corporate sector? Now, one decision that has to be made by the organizers is, when do you bring in the corporate sector? For example, if you bring in the leading corporate sectors now, and we are just having a discussion, maybe it's okay, it's a debate. But if we are trying to move into something like action on a more or less consensus basis, then it might be useful, at least in phase one, to have like-minded people and like-minded groups, although in different stakeholder constituencies, and then decide what to do, and then after that have a dialogue with the corporate sector, rather than they be inside here designing what we're going to do, because that can damage what we want to do. This, of course, did happen at some stage in the Helsinki process also, in which when we came out with the final report, the corporate sector then came in and then watered down the final report, and that was the only meeting they were there, if you remember. On states, people and inequality, I think that is correct, and that is why we have multi-stakeholder here. When we talk of a country, it's people as well as government. Some governments are legitimate, but not totally democratic. Some governments are totally illegitimate, and you can't even engage with them. The only thing is to try to change them, change the regime. And many governments are in between the two, at least in the developing countries. I think the issue raised by our friend from Thailand is very relevant and very good, and combined with what Mary Robinson has said, how do we build the capacity of democracy from the bottom up, that is, to give power to people who are powerless and voiceless, particularly the poor, to help them to organize themselves and to channel their voices to governance. And training programs or capacity building would be extremely important. And to some extent, top-down as well. That is, how do you teach the powers that be how to be more democratic? And I would be very interested in what Mary Robinson has said, democracy, not just voting every 4 or 5 years in which people with money are able to carry the candidates, but participatory democracy. What does that mean? What are the concrete examples? What are the models? So that kind of capacity building needs to include participatory democracy. Thank you.
So I think, thanks very much for the interventions, and specifically to the panelists for their excellent contribution. We have heard so many things about the participatory democracy and the need to have the structures of accountability. We'll be connecting ourselves to the Mo Ebrahim Foundation to get the details, and I would invite others to do the same in order to get the gist of the structures of accountability, which are so pertinent in participatory democracy. But of course, we also heard about the democratic deficits, and I think these are the issues that we need to know as we talk about globalization, democracy, globalization, the global economy, global governance, and the climate changes. What is it really that we are talking about? We have been fed very extensively this morning. Now, I'm told the next thing we have to do is lunch, which everybody will participate. And
maybe just practical, just practical announcement, yes. Thank you very much for inviting us all for the lunch, which is upstairs. And just a couple of announcements. You see, we will meet again 14 hours in the auditorium, because then the President of Finland will come there. And we try to be there because she comes a few minutes after 14 hours. We should be there on time. Well, please enjoy the buffet lunch.